South Africa, a land of stunning beauty, diverse cultures and a troubled past. For much of the 20th century, this nation was gripped by a system of racial segregation and discrimination known as apartheid. From 1948 to 1994, apartheid cast a long shadow over South Africa, brutally dividing its people along racial lines. This system, Africans for separateness, was not just a matter of social custom or prejudice. It was a rigid legal framework designed to cement the supremacy of the white minority over the black African majority. The impact of apartheid was all-encompassing, touching every aspect of life, from education and healthcare to housing and employment. Apartheid was more than just laws. It was a lived experience of oppression, fear, and inequality. It was a system that denied basic human rights and dignity to millions solely based on the color of their skin. Understanding apartheid is crucial to understanding modern-day South Africa. The story of apartheid is not just about oppression, however. It is also a story of resilience, resistance, and the ultimately triumphant struggle for freedom and equality. It is a story that continues to shape South Africa today as the nation grapples with the legacy of this dark chapter in its history. Apartheid was built on a foundation of discriminatory laws and acts. These laws were meticulously crafted to disenfranchise, control, and segregate the black African population. One of the cornerstones of this system was the Population Registration Act of 1950. This act classified every citizen into racial categories: white, black, coloured, and Indian. This seemingly simple act had far-reaching consequences, dictating where people could live, work, and even whom they could love. The Group Areas Act of 1950 further entrenched segregation. This act allocated specific residential areas for each racial group, forcibly removing people from their homes and communities. It led to the establishment of black townships, often characterized by overcrowding, poverty, and limited infrastructure. These laws were tools of social engineering, designed to keep racial groups separate and unequal. Another key pillar of apartheid was the Bantu Education Act of 1953. This act introduced a deliberately inferior education system for black South Africans. The aim was to limit their opportunities and keep them in subservient roles within society. Education, once a tool for empowerment, was twisted into a weapon of control. For black South Africans, life under apartheid was a constant struggle against an oppressive system. The myriad laws and regulations touched every aspect of their lives, from cradle to grave. Daily existence was shaped by fear, humiliation, and the constant threat of violence. One of the most degrading aspects of apartheid was the pass laws. These laws required black South Africans to carry passbooks, internal passports that controlled their movement. Failure to produce a passbook on demand could lead to arrest, detention, or even worse. The pass laws were a tool of control, restricting the movement of black labour and limiting their access to urban areas. They served as a constant reminder of the subjugated status of black South Africans. Public spaces were also segregated, with separate beaches, buses, benches, and even cemeteries for different racial groups. The indignity of these petty apartheid laws was a constant source of resentment and anger. The humiliation of being treated as a second-class citizen in your own country fueled the growing resistance movement. Section 4, A History of Defiance, Early Resistance to Apartheid. Despite the oppressive nature of the apartheid regime, the spirit of resistance flickered from the very beginning. Black South Africans refused to accept their fate passively. They organised, mobilised, and challenged the system at every turn. One of the earliest forms of resistance was the formation of political organisations like the African National Congress, or ANC, in 1912. The ANC, initially committed to peaceful protest, petitioned the government, organised demonstrations, and challenged discriminatory laws in court. However, the government's response was brutal. Peaceful protests were met with violence, and leaders were harassed, imprisoned, or forced into exile. The Defiance Campaign of 1952 marked a turning point. This campaign, spearheaded by the ANC and its allies, involved deliberate acts of defiance against unjust laws. Thousands of volunteers across the country defied segregation laws, refusing to carry passes, entering whites-only areas, and participating in other acts of civil disobedience. The government responded with mass arrests and increased repression. Section 5. Turning Points, Sharpeville, Soweto, and the Rise of Black Consciousness. The Sharpeville Massacre of 1960 marked a turning point in the struggle against apartheid. On March 21, 1960, police opened fire on a peaceful protest against the pass laws in Sharpeville, killing 69 unarmed demonstrators, many shot in the back as they fled. The Sharpeville Massacre sent shockwaves throughout South Africa and the world. It shattered any illusions about the peaceful intentions of the apartheid regime and galvanized international condemnation. The government responded by banning the ANC and driving the liberation movement underground. Another pivotal moment came in 1976 with the Soweto uprising. Thousands of schoolchildren took to the streets of Soweto to protest the forced use of Afrikaans as a language of instruction in schools. The police responded with brutal force, killing hundreds of students. The Soweto uprising brought the brutality of apartheid into sharp focus for a new generation. It also saw the rise of the Black Consciousness movement, which emphasized black pride, self-reliance, and cultural identity. Section 6. The world takes notice, international condemnation and sanctions. As the brutality of the apartheid regime became increasingly apparent, the international community began to take notice. The Sharpeville Massacre, and the Soweto uprising in particular, sparked widespread outrage and condemnation. The United Nations condemned apartheid as a crime against humanity and imposed various sanctions on South Africa. These sanctions ranged from arms embargoes to cultural and sporting boycotts. While the sanctions had a limited impact initially, they gradually began to bite. The international community's growing isolation of South Africa had a profound psychological impact. It challenged the regime's legitimacy and highlighted the moral bankruptcy of apartheid. The divestment movement, which called for foreign companies to withdraw investments from South Africa, also gained momentum. This movement, driven by activists, students and ethical investors, put significant pressure on multinational corporations to cut ties with the apartheid regime. While the South African government initially dismissed the impact of sanctions, they gradually began to take a toll on the economy. Section 7. The Price of Freedom, the Armed Struggle and Internal Unrest. Faced with escalating state violence and repression, some within the liberation movement believed that armed struggle was the only path to freedom. In the early 1960s, the ANC, along with its ally, the South African Communist Party, or SACP, formed Umkhonto we Sizwe, MK, the armed wing of the ANC. MK launched a series of sabotage attacks on government installations, aiming to make the country ungovernable and force the regime to the negotiating table. However, the armed struggle came at a cost. The government responded with even greater repression, and many innocent people were caught in the crossfire. The 1980s saw a dramatic escalation in violence. South Africa was engulfed in a low-intensity civil war, with townships becoming battlegrounds between security forces and anti-apartheid activists. The government also unleashed a wave of state-sponsored violence, targeting activists, trade unionists, and anyone deemed a threat to the regime. The cost of the struggle was immense.